agree to stay. Thanks, Julius. And now I've got the pleasure of introducing Kelsey. Kelsey is a birth mother who spent several years working in the adoption field, both as a paralegal on the West Coast and in adoption agencies in the Midwest and in the East Coast. Kelsey is the fourth generation in her family to relinquish a child for adoption, and her whole life has been uniquely impacted by adoption as a result of that. She earned her undergraduate degree from South Dakota State University and is currently working on her Master's of Public Administration from the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. Kelsey is the Director of Policy and Advocacy at Ethical Family Building in California, where she works on important public policy issues impacting the adoption triad and adoption professionals across the country. I'll be putting a link to that in the chat, as well as some other things that Kelsey's involved in. Kelsey is the co-producer of an upcoming documentary, Love Your Birth Mom. She's also the co-host of a podcast for birth moms called Twisted Sisters Podcast. And she's the co-author of a book called Adoption Unfiltered: Revelations from Adoptees, Birth Parents, Adoptive Parents, and Allies, which is coming out at the end of the year. Kelsey resides in Northern California with her husband and her daughter. And with that, I will hand it over to her. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, my husband just walked in at a really terrible time. Thank you. So I'm Kelsey. I have no work-life balance, according to that bio. So I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy at Ethical Family Building. We're a nonprofit in LA. We work to safeguard domestic adoption through education, transparency, and accountability among adoption professionals and those impacted by adoption. I have, obviously, from my bio, I've spent several years working in adoption, but for the past 2 years, I've definitely found my home working in public policy. I am very passionate about women, children, families, and especially in adoption matters. So through our work at Ethical Family Building, we have an extensive network of licensed professionals in about 45 states. We also love our relationships that we've built with other groups that advocate for those impacted by adoption, such as Adoption Network Cleveland. And we're really grateful for the work they're doing that expands beyond Ohio. And Ethical Family Building has two main projects. One of them is Adopt Match. Adopt Match is a platform that has education for expectant moms and helps them connect with our licensed partners that are local to them. And then we require our partners to uphold our 4 guiding principles. The first one of those is separate legal representation for both parties, expectant parents and adoptive parents. Written post-adoption contact agreements, quality post-placement support, and counseling for the birth mom. And number 4 is reasonable and justifiable fees for adoptive parents. So all of our partners have to uphold those standards. We vet them extensively, and we have them reaffirm those guiding principles annually. So Adopt Change is our second project. It is a new platform that will feature a searchable database of adoption professionals in the United States. And it will tell you if they're licensed or not, what state they're licensed in, what websites they own, where they're located, who owns the entity, if they're for-profit or nonprofit, etc. It will also feature comprehensive and updated information about all 50 states' adoption laws regarding unlicensed entities and advertising, which we're going to talk about today. So this topic is one I have been presenting on and talking about ad nauseum for several years now, along with my team at Ethical Family Building. So the first thing that you need to know is that private domestic adoption is governed by state law, pretty much only. There are exceptions, like there's the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act, the MIPA. So that is governed, that's a federal law, but that's only if you're licensed and if you're receiving federal funding. So, but for everything else, it's governed by state law. 50 different states have set sets of state statutes. And if you've ever tried to look up a law for anything in your state about literally anything, you'll know that nothing is simple or cut and dry. So when I say something like unlicensed adoption intermediaries are not permitted in Michigan, you can bet that that law does not say it that way. That's not the language that's used. So it's one factor as to why there's so much confusion on this topic. Nobody really knows what the law really says because it's so confusing. So our team at Ethical Family Building has done a ton of legal and legislative research to sort out which states allow which practice, but it's not usually as simple. So Indiana may prohibit this, California allows that. My recommendation for anyone that is interested in adopting is to consult with a Quad A adoption lawyer very early on. Get to know what your state laws are in your state. Someone else may have told you that you don't need a lawyer till the very end. And I'm here to tell you that what we are hearing from adoption agencies and adoption attorneys is that people are trying to DIY it until the very end. And then they'll hire an agency or attorney because they realize that they need one. And these licensed professionals are telling us that they're receiving absolute dumpster fire cases filled with state law violations. And sometimes it's too late to patch it all up. So do your due diligence beforehand, consult with an adoption attorney, maybe two, get to know the process for you in your state. So what is a broker? What is an unlicensed entity? Adoption broker is not a legal term. You're not going to go look into your state statutes and see broker. Brokers aren't welcome here. But many labels and categories that entities give themselves are not found in state law either. You may hear some terms thrown around when you're pursuing adoption, like facilitator, consultant, advertiser, referral service, matching service, etc. Sometimes I feel like people come up with new terms every day. So what's the difference between these categories? We don't really know. There is no legal delineation between these categories. So we don't know what to do with that. So what I need you to do is take your brain out and break it apart and then scoop out all the information that you think you know about facilitators and consultants and referral services and matching services, and then toss it, throw it away, because it doesn't matter, and put your brain back together and receive new information. This is how we look at them. So we analyze what services they render and what actions and what elements they meet according to their state law. So I'm going to talk about, I'm going to pull out Indiana's law as an example. So Indiana code says that it defines adoption services first. So adoption services in Indiana can mean the arranging for the placement of a child, identifying a child for adoption, matching adoptive parents with biological parents, arranging or facilitating adoption, taking or acknowledging consents or surrenders for termination of parental rights for adoption purposes, performing background studies on a child who is going to be adopted or adoptive parents, making determinations concerning the best interests of a child and the appropriateness of placing the child for adoption, post-placement monitoring of a child before the child is adopted. And then it also has exclusions. So adoption services does not mean legal services provided by an attorney licensed in Indiana. Adoption-related services provided by a governmental entity or person appointed to perform an investigation by the court, general education and training on adoption issues. So Betsy at Adoption Network Cleveland can do education for adoption in Indiana. That's fine. She's not doing matching or anything like that. Post-adoption services, supportive services to families to promote the well-being of the members. That's also something that you can do as well. And then also this provision does not apply to a licensed child placement agency in Indiana, the Division of Family Resources, Department of Child Services, a licensed agency, a licensed attorney. And so that's kind of how we see a lot of laws broken down, but not all of them. Some of them, they define what it constitutes as adoption services, and then tells you who's allowed to do this. And if you don't see if you don't see an unlicensed entity in any capacity, then they're not allowed to perform those services. Now, sometimes, without getting too much into the weeds, these services may not be comprehensive. They might be a little more basic. Indiana really digs deep. So maybe I feel like Alabama is one off the top of my head where they're very vague. And so it's unclear if they prohibit unlicensed entities or not. But again, what we are looking for is we're looking at how they practice, and then we're matching that up with the state law and seeing if that certain service that they're rendering is allowed in that state. So what we typically are seeing is that these are individuals or very small staffed entities who operate on a for-profit basis. They charge people who are interested in adopting, or sometimes we say prospective adoptive parents or hopeful adoptive parents, they charge them exorbitant non-refundable finder's fees in exchange for matching them with an expectant mom who is considering adoption. What makes these entities unqualified? So they're not subject to any educational, social work, or legal training requirements. There's no license or certification, and they're not subject to any discipline or oversight by any governmental or private public entity. They advertise online a lot of times. They are sometimes fraudulently advertising themselves as an agency. I know there's a broker who's unlicensed who is advertising themselves, and I think I found them advertising in 35 different states, and each ad says Adoption Agency Alabama, Adoption Agency Georgia. You're not just born knowing how to navigate the adoption process, either as a mom or a family. And so when you're Googling for adoption help and you click on an ad that says Adoption Agency California, you think it's very much an adoption agency in California. Why would you think anything different? So we're seeing them boldly advertise themselves as licensed adoption agencies. We're seeing this several times. Adoption brokers are not allowed to legally operate in 28 states. And then 33 states take it a step further and say, not only can you not operate here, you cannot advertise here. And we have a lot of states that are silent. They don't have laws on the issue. They might be a little behind the times. And then we have some states that maybe attempted to prohibit the practice, but their language wasn't comprehensive enough. We've seen some states allow it with restrictions, and some states are just very unclear, like the Alabama law. And the great thing is that nobody's enforcing this. It's not a great thing. Some state law has no penalty attached. And so some states have no designated like agency for oversight, and there's no jurisdiction in charge of this oversight. They just don't know who should be enforcing this. It's not in the law. So I always tell this story to legislators when I meet with them. There's a colleague of mine in Texas. She might even be on this call. I don't know. There's a colleague of mine in Texas. She owns a licensed agency, and she reports unlicensed activity in her state every year. Every time she sees ads, every time she sees someone coming in to match, because you're not allowed to do that in Texas if you're not licensed. She reports it to the licensing board, the Texas Agency Licensing Board, every year. And then she has this big red binder full of correspondence from like a decade at least. She sends it to Texas licensing. They say, take it to the AG. This isn't our business. This is outside of our jurisdiction. So she takes it to the AG, and the AG sends her a letter back that says, take this to licensing. We don't need to cover this. And so it's a ping pong back and forth, passing the buck, and nobody is really taking responsibility. And in the meantime, there's just a lot going wrong. Another reason that this is a problem, I'm just going to give you a hypothetical. So let's say you are a person who is pursuing adoption to build your family. You live in Georgia. You have just paid $20,000 to an unlicensed entity to act as an intermediary and arrange a match between you and an expectant mom who lives in Ohio. And then any number of things go wrong. The entity was withholding information about her background. The mom disappeared and you never received any proof of pregnancy. The entity, you actually had paid an additional $16,000 for expectant mom's living expenses through that unlicensed entity, which is in Ohio, $13,000 over the limit that is allowed for living expenses in Ohio. And so now you've violated that state law. And now there is no placement. Mom may have never been serious about placement, but your unlicensed professional didn't do their due diligence. And you have an unlicensed intermediary who has happily taken a total of $36,000 from you, provided no meaningful services, has breached their fiduciary obligations by neglecting to do basic due diligence. And so now what? What do you do? This has happened to so many adoptive parents. I can't even tell you how many emails and calls we've gotten about this issue. This is happening all over the United States in every state. So who do you tell? Who do you report this to? Who do you file a complaint with? Nobody. The only recourse option that you have is civil litigation, which by the way, you don't have money for because you're $36,000 short. You don't have the money for it. There's no oversight structure for people who conduct business in a gray market. They're operating outside of licensure. They're operating outside of the law. There's no oversight for it, except for a civil suit, which if you get a judgment, which is possible, if you get a judgment, it's likely not going to stop them from doing it to the next person. In fact, by the time you finish your years-long trial, they've probably done it to countless other families in the meantime. So outside of licensure, outside of the intended framework for the delicate placement of children, there's no recourse. Moms who relinquish under the pretense of fraud or coercion have even fewer options for recourse. And what it is it's recourse is simply inaccessible. It is for the people who can afford it, and it cuts out anybody else below that class of people if they've been wronged by these entities. I did get a question about social media matching and stuff like that, and that's a super hot topic right now. We see a ton of just ignorance on social media. Ignorance comes across in giving terrible advice. I've seen anything from telling people that you don't need a home study to telling people that you need, I saw this one the other day actually. Oh, call these people, they got a Latino baby and you can get one too. You just have to pay X amount of dollars. It's terrible, terrible, terrible advice, and really just a bad environment for adoptions and placements of children. It's a little harder to pin down the matching on social media, but it's something that's certainly on our radar. It's hard to track if people are getting paid for these services. And according to state laws, that's really the thing that the state law is looking for. You can't provide all these services and be paid for them. So, but we have seen some really devastating cases come out of matching in Facebook groups. And I had another, or kind of in the same question, I know someone asked about photo listing. They asked about posting kids' pictures on online. That's also a huge, huge problem that's going on right now, as well as posting kids' pictures online, putting videos and all kinds of stuff online of these kids that are potentially available for adoption. Some of that gets into the foster care system as well, which I'm not as familiar with. That's not my lane, but photo listing, there's a lot of state laws on photo listing as well. So I would encourage you to, again, talk to a Quad A attorney and see if that's even allowed in your state. I personally think the Facebook and social media matching is something that is probably going to have to come from the social media companies themselves to crack down on, because it is, I don't know what level of enforcement the government would take on in that realm, but I could be wrong. We'll see. Some of the risks, there's risks for everybody involved if you're using an unlicensed entity or broker. So expectant and birth parents stand to gain a whole lot, stand to lose a whole lot, not gain, stand to lose a whole lot from working with an unlicensed entity. And a lot of times they have no idea, even after completing the adoption, that they weren't even using an agency. My bosses are attorneys. They own a nonprofit law firm in Los Angeles that only represents expectant moms considering adoption, so that they have legal representation. We see all the time moms come in for representation and they're like, my agency, and we have to explain this is not an agency. They don't have the qualifications of an agency. There's no license, and they need to know this. About 20 years ago and more, at least 20 years ago, to find information about adoption, you would look, you'd find like a local agency to help you. You would probably look in the yellow pages, you'd talk to your medical provider, and now we all go to the internet. I think in 2014, the Congressional Coalition on Adoption Institute did a study. They surveyed Americans' attitudes towards adoption, and they found that while most people believed that the internet was not a trustworthy source of information, they did also believe that that is the one place that they would go to find information about adoption. And that's the one place that they would recommend to their family and friends to go to find information about adoption. Expectant parents are at the mercy of their location. When they conduct a Google search looking for adoption help, the paid ads at the top of the page are 9 times out of 10, either A, unlicensed, or B, licensed, but they're out of state and therefore unable to provide local services. I even see ads from an unlicensed broker that are saying housing and free housing, get paid for an adoption, stuff like that. Kind of these dangling carrots that are in the Google ads for moms, letting them know, I think like framing their mind for what the adoption process can do for them. When in reality, I don't think moms start searching for adoption because they need money, but that's definitely what they find in the ads, and that's reframing their perspective about what choosing adoption could do for them, monetarily especially. They don't, like I said before, they don't know that they should ask if this place is licensed. They don't know why they should be working with someone that is licensed. And a lot of times, yeah, they go through the whole process. They had no idea. She's confused about the status of the entity many times. And then as a result, she's not counseled on her rights. Brokers aren't offering them separate legal representation. And she's not a client. She has no real advocate in this arrangement. Approximately half of our placements right now are interstate placements, and that's totally due to the internet and the open communication that we have. This is not necessarily a bad thing. If I am an expectant mom and I want my child to grow up in the place I grew up in Indiana, I want her to live in a middle-class home and live the way I grew up. I live in California. I certainly want that option if that's something that I really desire for my child. But if it's an interstate adoption, there's 2 different states with 2 different sets of statutes governing that. So somebody's waiving their rights. It's usually her, because A, she usually doesn't have her own separate legal representation to tell her what she may be giving up by waiving her rights. And waiving your rights is not a bad thing, but it's all about informed consent. We have to be informing everybody in the process of what we're doing and why we're doing it, and giving them options and choices. Approximately, let's see, wait, I already said that. So let's say mom is in California and family is in Utah, and broker is telling her to waive her rights in California and then conform to Utah state rights. She's going to lose her revocation period because Utah doesn't have one and California has 30 days. So if that's what she wants, great. If she's been counseled on that, great. But no one is telling her what she's giving up if she doesn't have her own legal representation. And if she doesn't have her own legal representation, then someone's giving her unlawful legal advice. She is likely deprived of support resources in her local area before, during, and after the adoption when using a broker. There's no such thing as options counseling for her. I just saw a case being sent out on a listserv by a broker where they are trying to match a mom who is 8 weeks pregnant. She just peed on the stick. So she's clicking on ads from unlicensed. They're not going to say, hey, I would love to work with you, but first I need you to go get options counseling. And also, we don't match this early in the process. So let's see what support services we can connect you with, and let's see if we can exhaust our options beforehand. There are certainly licensed agencies that do that, and they should do that if they're not doing it. So we can't be matching, and it's a huge risk on the adoptive parent side if they start paying living expenses for a mom that's 8 weeks pregnant. It's unlikely that that match is going to come to fruition into a successful adoption. It's very unlikely. It's not impossible, but it's very unlikely. And then in the worst of cases for expectant moms or birth moms, she could be trafficked. We do see moms being trafficked to Utah a lot by a certain broker on the East Coast. She's a lot of times plucked from her local support system, her family, her friends, and her familiarity with her area. And she's bussed out to Utah, and baby is brokered in an adoption for $70K plus. It's astounding. It's heartbreaking. It's so wrong. And then she's bussed back right after, day after discharge from the hospital. So the risks for people who are interested in adoption, people who are pursuing adoption, we've talked about the hypothetical earlier, the no recourse. It's a huge risk, and being rinsed financially of your life savings is another huge risk. But another thing that they're at risk for is emotional distress. When we get these calls and emails from families, they are just completely drained emotionally, and so much of this is preventable. They're often coming from a background of infertility struggles, and they are exhausted. They are feeling defeated when they even arrive to adoption at all. And so when they are now being put through the ringer in a transactional adoption process, this just compounds it. And we see this distress playing out both in families who have not had a successful adoption, as well as those who have. We see families who get to the finish line, but what they think is the finish line, because adoption is lifelong, it's not the finish line. We see them take this baby home and feel like disgusted. They love this child, they're going to do right by this child, but they know that the way they brought this child home was not the right way. And that's something they have to live with and eventually tell their child about one day. And it's a very heavy burden to carry. Most importantly, the biggest risk in this is for adoptees. This is not a risk that these kids are willingly taking themselves. This is a risk that the adults in the equation are taking for this child. We all have to be responsible and level-headed adults for the sake of our children, and transactional adoption processes make our children a commodity. The biggest argument I hear against this is that licensed agencies and attorneys do it too. And you're so right. We have terrible players in adoption in all aspects. We have some really egregious professionals who are licensed. However, we have oversight infrastructure in place. It is not perfect, and it needs a ton of work. We need clear laws and jurisdictions for enforcement. We need active oversight systems. And even though licensed agencies and attorneys are not exempt from these bad practices, we do not believe the answer is to go backwards and open it wide open for anyone and everyone to come play games on the adoption field. We need regulation in place for the protection of families and moms and children. The bottom line is that adoption is intended to find a family for a child and not to find a child for a family. This notion has certainly been lost as a result of adoption becoming a consumerist industry. And the professionals, both licensed and unlicensed, have contributed to this. However, we cannot lose sight of this. We can't stray further away from the sole intention of adoption to find a family for a child. And private adoption is not exempt from this intention just because they operate outside of the public sector child welfare system. One of my favorite quotes regarding this issue is actually from my boss, and she was featured in the Time magazine article about brokers in 2020, I believe now. And it's a civilized society protects children and vulnerable populations. It doesn't let the free market loose on them. And I think that's exactly on the nose. Fees are continuing to climb. Ads are becoming more and more bold. And we have a plan for change that we've been working on for a long time. We want to enforce existing state laws, the ones that are good law. They have a penalty. We want to encourage the state, the AG, the licensing board, whoever is willing to take up the task to enforce that and protect the residents of their state. B, we want to fill legislative gaps at the federal level. We want brokers to be out of adoption, completely out. If you are unlicensed and you're arranging adoptions and you're providing adoption services that would otherwise be provided by licensed adoption agencies, I either want you to A, get licensed and submit yourself to the oversight of your state, or B, get on Indeed and find a different job. C, my last thing is education, and I think that's one of the most important things. It's what we're doing here. It's what Betsy does. It's what we do at Ethical Family Building. We educate, disseminate information to expectant and adoptive parents about what to look for in an adoption provider. So I think that the law cannot move without the culture and the hearts and the minds. And so that's just as important as legislation. So yeah, that's what I've got. I don't even know. I think I'm right on time.
You are. Thank you so much, Kelsey. That was a lot, and I'm sure it was really triggering for a lot of people who are online. So I hope everybody has avenues for support after this program. So we did have a few questions that came in, Kelsey, and feel free to put other questions or comments in the chat. We're together till 9. We had one person say that she was, I'm assuming, online watching a conference, and that an audience member was discussing how facilitators are illegal, but that nothing's done about it. And the panel at the conference apparently said that they didn't feel like anything could be done until there was a federal law. And this person's asking, do you see that on the horizon in the future, a federal law?
Yeah, I do see a federal law in the future. Right now, we're waiting for one to be introduced that we've authored. And so I would just say stay tuned. Also, but something interesting to come out of Tennessee, a law just passed recently within like 2 months, I think, where they strengthened the penalty and the recourse provision for facilitation. I didn't necessarily love it. I don't think it's a bad thing. They made it easier for adoptive parents to pursue civil action. So litigation, but they made it a little easier to pursue, which I can appreciate. I can appreciate the pursuit of enforcement on some level. I wish it was more accessible, but that's, you know, I know the good thing is I know Tennessee has their eye on the issue. So, yeah.
Thanks. We also had a question: how often do you find agencies not acting within the law in your work, and how do you typically find out about them? And what does your organization do once you find out?
We've definitely taken partners off our list that we've discovered to not be upholding our standards or not operating within the law. We think our standards are low-hanging fruit. These are very basic things that you can be doing, and to have an ethical practice on some level. And so, but when agencies are not acting within the law in my work, we encourage people to report. There is an oversight structure for a reason. If you're an agency in Minnesota and you violate the law, I can't go report you unless I was involved in the case, but the adoptive parents or the birth parents can report. I think there's a lot of fear on reporting because if the adoption hasn't been finalized yet and you report, there's fear of retaliation. Birth parents, there's a ton of fear of retaliation, whether it's open adoption contact or whatever. But I think this has to be a more trusted system. The work, just once we get the unlicensed brokers out, if we get the unlicensed brokers out, the work is not done. There's so much work that needs to be done in strengthening these systems of oversight for licensed agencies and attorneys as well.
Kelsey, somebody was asking in relation to what I think you were just saying, report to whom? Where would you find, how do you find out who to report to report something?
Yeah, so if it's an unlicensed broker, I'm going to say good luck. But if you have some clear violations, let me know. I have been kind of fielding those reports. Not that I am personally responsible for making things happen, and but there are ways in which we can connect you with or help you connect with an attorney who can take your case and pursue litigation. If it's a license agency, you would go to your licensing board. So whoever mans that, which is usually like your Department of Child and Family Services. And then if it's an attorney, the state bar.
Thank you. I know in Ohio, I recently had occasion to look that up, and it's you report a concern about an unlicensed broker to the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services, and then they report it to the Attorney General or the local law enforcement. There's a whole list of people. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what they would do with that information.
That's the question. Yeah.
A lot of questions about the bill that you mentioned. Who's the author? Are you working with a specific legislator?
Yeah, Annie Custer in New Hampshire. And we're looking for a Republican to be on it as well, so it's bipartisan.
That's the federal
she's
bill.
A Democrat. Mm-hmm.
Okay. You mentioned human trafficking in terms of the birth mother being imported to a different state that maybe has more laws that they want to have the adoption governed by. Have you seen any viable discussion about the baby being human trafficked?
I haven't. I think that's a really interesting point, especially with the overturn of Roe and the discussion of viability. I don't think we've seen enough movement in the viability argument to make that argument for trafficking, because we haven't even really been seeing that argument taken as seriously for trafficking the woman, if that makes sense. We hear trafficking and we think sex trafficking and labor trafficking, and we don't always hear about, like, this is like almost like reproductive trafficking in a way. But yeah, that's an interesting point. I don't know. We'll have to see what happens with that.
I don't so much mean even pre-birth, but once that baby's born and then changes hands, if what led up to that whole thing is not a legal process.
I don't know. And I think and it's always usually like where the baby is born. That's and to leave the state. So a lot of times we see several different hands in the pot, right? We have got a broker and an agency and an attorney, and so attorney may be in adoptive parents state in Colorado, and then, well, Colorado's not a good example because they're agency only. In New Mexico, they're in their state with their attorney, and then maybe their agency is in Utah and their broker's in Virginia, and mom is in Massachusetts. So she's getting moved to Utah, and then baby's born in Utah. And at that moment, baby's born there. That's all that matters, Utah. So then, but when mom and dad want to take baby back to New Mexico, they leave through ICPC in Utah and they enter through ICPC. And this is all paperwork. This is all theoretical. This is not like they're walking into the ICPC office. But they have to go through that interstate placement process with their paperwork. So.
One person was asking about your organization and the funding that you received to do research and analysis. Are you a 501c3?
Yeah, so right now we're funded by a private donor, but we need to diversify that so badly. So we are a 501c3 and we do take donations.
Thanks. A couple of people did put in the chat things about Tennessee. This is going back to when you were mentioning about Tennessee at least trying to address some of these, and this was something I didn't realize. The Tennessee law now allows mothers to relinquish while they're still pregnant. That's not even after birth.
Yeah, there's a couple of states that allow pre-birth consent, which is abominable. Washington is one of them. Arkansas is, even though it's not in their law, it is by precedent, by case law, maybe, I don't know. But yeah, they allow it. And I've heard about the Tennessee thing. I haven't had time to look up the statute yet. So if you guys have a link for that, that would be really helpful for me. I'm really interested in seeing that, because that's not good.
Somebody's putting in Hawaii, Alabama, and Tennessee, so maybe those states all allow relinquishment before pre-birth.
Okay.
I hope I've captured the questions. I know there's some comments. So you mentioned exorbitant fees by unlicensed providers. What's exorbitant? Give us some examples.
Yeah, so I think one of the most important things about the fees is that a lot of times they're non-refundable, and they are required to be wired or overnighted with like cashier's checks in 24 to 48 hours after a match is made. And most of the time that match is like maybe a phone call or maybe no communication at all. They're just saying, mom picked you. If you want to match with her, then you send us the money. And it must be, we've seen this language on a lot of communications. It must be liquid funds readily available, no loans, no second mortgage on your house. It has to be liquid. So I'm seeing brokers say that their fees are $18,000 to $22,000 roughly for the match, and it's non-refundable. And then if that match falls through, you're out. You don't get the money back. But that money is just the contract to contract with them. So that's not the living expenses money, because a lot of times, and we're seeing living expenses go up past $20,000 a lot of times in these cases. Just extraordinary fees. And then, you know, the facilitator broker, they don't do their due diligence, and then the match falls apart. We've seen sometimes, we saw a case where the match lasted for 3 days and the living expenses was paid and the match fee was paid, and over a 3-day period this family lost $38,000 and didn't get a penny back. And usually we're not seeing pregnancy verifications, not legitimately. No medical records. It's just it's wire fraud. Where's the FBI? So
What is your experience with, if any, race issues relating to this? So I've known agencies in the past that had race-based price lists. A Black baby, I mean, this is years ago, a
no, we
Black
still
baby at
see
that
it.
point in time was $3,000, and this is many years ago, so I know fees have increased a lot, but the Black baby was $3,000, a biracial baby was $6,000, and a white baby was $10,000. And
Yeah.
they had this as a published list. I mean, this is probably 25 years ago, but
Yeah, I think Lori Holden's in this chat, I think. And Lori, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we saw an NPR article that said on average, and I think this article is from 10 years ago. And I know a lot of agencies have changed their policies, but I know a lot of them haven't. And I think the NPR article said something like there was an average $8,000 price difference between the adoptions of Black babies and the adoptions of white babies. We do see race-based pricing still to this day. It's not gone away. A justification I've heard for it, which is not my justification, but it's professionals' justification that do this. They have said that it's hard, Black babies are harder to place or something. And first of all, I don't think that's true in any way, shape, or form. But and yeah, I've seen like the special needs. I think Rebecca put that in the chat. Special needs, but it's like being a minority is not special needs. But yeah, I've seen justifications for it that aren't really justifying it. That's just explaining away. I think it's awful. And I think if you can afford to like discount the adoption of a child, then you're probably charging too much in the first place. So you don't have justifiable fees.
So one person is putting in the chat that it seems nuts that prospective parents would fall for such scams. And I've known, and I'm sure you've seen situations too, where, some people who are, very practical, well-balanced, successful people, but they, in my opinion, lose perspective, in the midst of all this and end up, doing things that maybe a rational person would see through, but it's, you find yourself in maybe a desperate state.
Yeah, I see that a lot. I've talked to some families who are they're very well educated. They've got good, great education, higher education. They've got great jobs. They have to use their critical thinking skills all the time. And for some reason, when they get into this space, there's a level of desperation, and also there's an egging on by the industry. I always think that we don't tell people the truth. There's the simple equation is that there's a ton of, I don't have the number. Sometimes I hear 40 to every one infant available for adoption. Sometimes you hear 100 waiting parents for every one infant that's available for adoption. We don't track data, so we don't really know the number. But what we do know is there's way more. The ratio is way off balance. Way more parents waiting to adopt than there are children that are available for adoption, infants that are available for adoption. And so, we are not telling people that there's a huge possibility that you're going to never get a placement. And it's a huge conversation that needs to happen. It has to. Not everybody's going to go home with a baby, but we have, there's a broker in Illinois. They have 900 families on their site. There's no way in this day and age that they're going to send all 900 of those families home with a baby in their 2-year contract period. There's no way it's going to happen. And so, but they're taking each of those families $20,000 every 2-year period. And that's it. It's a way to float them. If you remember the Independent Adoption Center, the IAC thing that happened gosh, I want to say 2017 or something. The agency folded and they had like, I don't know, a couple hundred families on their site, maybe like 300 or 400 families on their site, and they just folded, but they were using these families' fees to float their agency. And it doesn't work. And also everybody figures you out after a while, but I think we have to also have a frank conversation with the people that are hoping to adopt. Not everybody is, and not in a way that promotes competition. I see this too. You got to market yourself. You got to get out there. You got to advertise yourself, put yourself out there. Okay, well, also, you'll also have to know that this might not happen, and you have to find a way to be okay with that before you turn off your judgment and, you know, drain your accounts.
Thank you. We've got a question about open adoption. This person says, as an adoptee, I constantly hear, yes, that was in, but now there's open adoption. How do you prepare first moms regarding open adoption?
Oh, I think we don't prepare them at all. I have an open adoption. There's so much that you don't know that you can't know before you enter it. I'm grateful for my openness that it's still open. But I think we always say that adoptive parents should be educated, and that's so totally true. And I still think that they're undereducated, but we don't do anything to educate expectant moms. Adopt Matches platform, it serves as an education touch point, but it's certainly not comprehensive. I want it to be eventually, but we don't. Moms need options counseling. They need exhaustive resources for parenting, and they just need a whole lot. They need written post-adoption contact agreements, even when not enforceable. I could go on. Open adoption is marketed very differently than how it actually takes place. Open adoption is marketed as it's like a fix-all for all of the ails of the closed adoption era. Open adoption is not a band-aid for the problems that exist with adoption in general. Open adoption took away some level of the secrecy involved with closed adoption, not all of it, but some of it. And there's different hurts in open adoption than there are in closed. So it's not a fix-all. It certainly needs to be done better and marketed to, well, not marketed at all, really, just educated on the realities of it. I could go on in another session for that one, but I won't.
We'll have you back.
Yeah.
So this is maybe a good idea. Maybe you have this such good advice. Do you have a general top things not to do list for adoptive parents, for prospective parents?
Oh, and the Adopt Change thing, I see her comment below. Adopt Change is coming out next month, although the date keeps changing. But I'm gonna make sure it comes out next month, or I'm gonna get a new job. So the top things not to do. Well, don't hire an unlicensed broker, for one. Please don't do it. And I know that there's some families in here that have said like that happened to us, so they can tell you too, don't do that. And I know some of these families in here actually were referred to the broker by their agency, so that makes it even harder. That their agency is recommending these places. Hi Becca, I just outed you. I know that's your story. So yeah, don't use those places. I think very much do your education. I hear a lot of people, they get sad and they get hopeless in like what they call the wait. And I think the wait is such an opportunity to do your education extensively, to, you know, attend sessions like these and talk to adoptees and birth parents and get perspective, you know, beyond the four walls of your home where you're waiting. And then also, you know, come to terms with like this, as Lori Holden talks about it all the time, this like pronatalist society. Come to terms with, ask yourself the question, what happens if it doesn't happen? we have to start asking ourselves that. So yeah. And I don't have like did you say, oh, top things? I thought it said top 10. I was like, I don't have 10. There's a bunch of stuff that you shouldn't do. But I think that's another session.
I think some of it boils down to, if you feel like something might be a red flag, take it really seriously.
Oh yeah.
To really examine. I think sometimes people are very vulnerable and, they maybe discount some of the red flags because they don't want to think it's true.
Yep.
So you brought up broker, and this is probably the last question just due to time.
Okay.
And there's a lot in chat. There's a lot about the race-based issues and chat about Angela Tucker. And so
Yeah.
there's a lot of links in there. So that's good. Click through. But you talked about agencies sometimes referring to unlicensed brokers and that sometimes creating a situation for adoptive parents. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I think we should, if you're being referred to somewhere that they want to outsource to another entity, at any time you should be asking, is this person licensed? Who is this person licensed by? And hopefully by the time that would ever happen, if it ever happens, and I hope it doesn't happen, you can get on Adopt Change and see if they're licensed for yourself. You should be asking your adoption agency too, like, what is it that they do that you can't do because you're social workers and I have an attorney, and there shouldn't really be much else that other party entity can do for you once you've already signed up with an agency. You don't need a broker. You don't need a facilitator.
I've had couples tell
necessary.
me in situations like that, when they first called me, we were working with this agency and they referred me to this other agency in another state. And I don't know that they even realize that the other agency isn't really an agency.
Right.
Yeah. And then they called the primary agency and they said, oh, you have to just work with these other people now, and not, didn't get any satisfaction.
Yeah.
I personally, I would ask too about entities being nonprofit. Many adoption agencies are nonprofit, but not all licensed agencies. And, I don't know if any adoption brokers are nonprofit, probably not, but,
there's a few, but it's not over. Most of them are for profit. The overwhelming majority are for profit, but I do think the nonprofit discussion is a huge one. It's so important. You should be able to look at their 990 and see all their information.
Okay. Well, I need to wrap things up. I know there's a lot of feelings and a lot of discussion, and I hope that people do find support. Keep the Adoption Network meetings in mind. We do have support groups for adoptees, birth parents, and adoptive parents, and we'll be happy to help you through. And there's lots of other great organizations doing similar work out there as well. I am going to put in the chat a quick survey. If you don't mind filling out your thoughts about this evening's program, it's really helpful for us to know what people think and to also have any ideas that you have for future topics, especially because everybody's juices are flowing right now. So please, it's a very brief survey. Take a minute to do that. Thank you so much, Kelsey, for volunteering to be with us this evening. Such an important topic and so informative. You covered an awful lot of ground, and we very much appreciate that. As many of you know, Adoption Network Cleveland, speaking of nonprofits, is a nonprofit. If you're interested in joining or knowing more about our work, please go to our website, which is adoptionnetwork.org. We are a membership organization, so if you like what you see, you're welcome to join, and we would love that. So thank you. And again, just a reminder that this is the last Monday evening speaker series for the session. We're taking a break for the summer, and you can watch our calendar for what's coming up in September. Nothing listed quite yet, but there will be soon. So thank you very much for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Good night.
Night.